Hello, my name is Chris Snipes, and you are listening to The Melt. A point that I've addressed several times on this show is how, when living in a society that is steeped in all types of media, we are more susceptible to the manipulation of this media. When the majority of our interaction with the greater world is filtered through various forms of media, we are subject to someone else's story and their own subjective perceptions of reality and all that that encompasses. Even this podcast is my version of reality as filtered through my perceptions and understanding of it. But hopefully, at least I am encouraging people to explore and question more and test things out for themselves rather than passively accept what I have to say as truth with a capital T. Critical thinking is such an important part of navigating the world, and we should apply this to all aspects of it, particularly to what we are told by those who might have motivations to deceive us. Sometimes these motivations might not be readily comprehensible, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. Even in my short life, I have seen how stories that get passed down from the old to the young get taken out of context and get wildly misinterpreted. So I can only imagine the implications of this happening over hundreds and thousands of years. Especially in today's climate, where it almost seems as if the generation gap is engineered to get ever wider. Today's guest, Howdy McCoskey, has written a book entitled Exposing the Expositions, Ancient Rome in America, that focuses on the time period between 1851 and 1920, which is a rather curious period when the world saw the proliferation of events that were called world expositions. These were supposed to serve the function of displaying the achievements of Western civilization, but Howdy posits that instead they could have actually been simultaneously erasing and rewriting history as it was known at the time. I start off this thought-provoking conversation by asking Howdy what compelled him to write this book.
Well, the book started early 2019 after a trip to Florence. So I had finished a book 15 years ago on ancient Egypt and the ancient Maya and sort of uncovering the lies of archaeology. Then I wrote a book that took about 8 years to write on my personal, you might call, journey after having a death experience and a revelation. And while I was waiting for that book to be published, I was in Florence looking at the cathedrals. I wanted to see how the cathedrals may have been used as energy structures and get a completely different sense of them. And then when I got back here, for some reason, I was looking around at some stuff on the internet, and I came across the 1893 Chicago Exposition. And I just looked into it a little bit and saw, wow, 700 acres of buildings, all built in 2 years, and then magically sort of destroyed when it was over. Okay. That was weird to start with. And then when I started just doing a little more research and started watching some other YouTube channels that had been out there, I didn't have a YouTube channel or anything at the time, watching people like John Levy and a few others that were talking about this stuff. And I started realizing from the research that there's, they had these all over the world. And it was the same thing. Build a massive fair, build these massive buildings, have this really interesting, weird technological, historical presentation, and then blow the whole thing up when it's done. Just destroy it. And so that right away made me say, there's a book to write here.
Yeah, and I was totally unawares of any of this. I mean, I'm sure they brushed upon world expositions when I was in school, and I, saw a few pictures throughout the course of that very brief window of learning, but I had no idea what all went into these things. They're extremely intricate.
Yeah, for anyone who doesn't know perhaps what we're talking about, I guess maybe by now people have seen me or heard of this stuff, but starting around 1851 in London, they had the first what's known as World Exposition or World Fair. And they supposedly built a giant thing called the Crystal Palace, like a massive greenhouse, but I mean massive, to house this huge exposition of stuff, basically, of showcasing everything you can imagine. These began to branch out through bigger ones in Paris, bigger ones in Germany, and they started eventually moving to the United States. The first large, well, they had some in New York. The first, what I would call next level of exposition was in Philadelphia in 1876. And that went through, yes, these ones in Chicago, Nashville, Omaha, St. Louis, San Francisco, right up to the end of the First World War. So this period between 1850 and 1915 is considered in exposition terms the fairs of the technological era. And all of them are built in massive style Greco-Roman buildings, towers, domes, and it was just, when I first looked at the photographs, it was beyond I was looking at ancient Rome. That's what I felt I was looking at. I'm looking at ancient Rome here, and something is really wrong with the picture, and hence began the research.
Well, what is so odd about the period of time that you point out between 1800 and 1920? What's going on between those dates?
Well, you've got so many. Again, once I started digging into it, first I thought I was just going to do a book on the Chicago Exposition. Then I found out all about all these other fairs. Then I started looking into the history of the cities themselves, the history of Chicago, the history of St. Louis, the history of San Francisco. And it doesn't matter what city you would look at, particularly North America, the history is unbelievable. It's obviously made up. And so you start looking into that, and then it's that whole time period that tends to kind of be ignored. I actually went through university and have a history degree, and I never spent a lot of time digging into the 1800s. It wasn't really a part of our courses almost ever. But you're dealing with first this era of Napoleon and this very strange combination war of 1812 in the United States. Then you have this very strange period of, like, we call it the year without a summer or something like that, was there all these comets, very weird experiences. Again, this potential weird famine. You push ahead 30 or 40 years. Now all of a sudden we hit the U.S. Civil War. We get photography. We get things like the Crimean War. We get things like the Franco-Prussian War, the destruction of the native Indians in North America. And then all of a sudden at the end of this period, here come the world fairs, and here come two other odd topics, one being the orphan trains, where these orphans are just found somewhere on the East Coast with no idea of who their parents are, where they came from, and then just shipped on trains out to the middle of the country. And at the same time, massive insane asylums being built all over the world. And the insane asylums, if you look them up on like Google, they're not just gigantic. They're bigger than Medici palaces in Florence. Like they're beautiful and ornate. And you're first thinking, where are all these insane people coming from? And why do you need to put them in something that, is like nicer than Buckingham Palace?
Yeah.
So again, at the whole period, there was just something wrong with that whole time in history, the way we are told it was.
Well, you even allude to the fact that these insane asylums may have been constructed to sort of contain the people who had knowledge of what came previously, right?
Yeah, my theories that came out of the writing of the book, and I guess I should back up. We can get to the theory in a second, but I should give you the presentation that I say often of why I moved into the study so deeply. And that was after about a month, I took the photographs to some building contractors that I know here in Norway. And without telling them what they were looking at, I just showed them like pictures of the Chicago Exposition, St. Louis Exposition, and of course they were like, "What is this?" And I was trying to tell, well, where do you think this is? Well, I don't know. Is this in Prague? Is this in Berlin? Is this whatever? No, this is Chicago. Like, what? No, it's not. And then I said, okay, if I was going to, and I showed them the whole exposition, the whole 700 acres. I showed them all the buildings, and I said, could you build that for me today with an unlimited budget and unlimited workforce. He said, yeah, I could build that. I said, how long would that take? The guy told me, well, I need 2 years to plan it because this is such a massive construction project. You're dealing with canals and lakes and trains and all. So that's 2 years of the planning. The landscaping is going to take 2 years because we have to, with the digging and making sure the water's correct and et cetera. And then the buildings, if I've got unlimited budget and 40 or 50,000 workforce, we could probably do that in 10 years. So if you give me 15 years, I could probably get this done for you. With modern machines, modern everything. And then I told him, well, they did this in 2 years. And his only answer was, that's not possible. And then he said, and if that's actually true, this is as great a building project as the Great Pyramid.
That's insane. And that went on all the time.
And and so they did this. Chicago, in its case, they burned it down. But then you look at like St. Louis. St. Louis was bigger. That had 1,000 acres. They also had the Summer Olympics that year. And as soon as it was over, they brought in a demolition crew from Chicago and with dynamite and blew the whole thing up and supposedly chucked it into landfills. And this would happen over and over and over again. And what became so weird about it, so the fairs were one. We'll get into what they were doing at the fairs because they're so strange themselves, what actually is happening. But all the fairs lost money, like massive amounts of money. The Philadelphia Fair lost $4 million in 1876. I don't know what that would be equivalent today, but that's a massive amount of money.
Absolutely.
And then they tore the whole thing down and chucked it in the garbage. And they thought, this is a good idea. Let's do this again and again and again and again. And so all of it, as you begin to, because if you think of Chicago, so supposedly they're supposed to have this fire in 1871, which like every city in North America has this fire that burns down part of the city. So they say. And so you would need buildings. That would make sense. You've just lost all of them in the fire. Hey, let's build these buildings for the exposition and then use them later because we need buildings. We've had this fire. No, just get rid of the buildings. And in fact, so strange is not only were they building 700 acres in Chicago at that time, Nelson Rockefeller decided the exact same year we should build the University of Chicago. So right along what became the Midway, they were also, again, supposedly building the entire University of Chicago in, of course, Baroque, Renaissance style with equivalent of cathedrals and giant Gothic buildings. And because 700 acres for the World's Fair, that's no problem. We can build other stuff at the same time. So it's all so strange once you began to look at it, and it's so well documented, Chris. This is the thing that blew my mind too. Was if you go to a website, you can go everybody yourselves called studylove.org. And you'll have to navigate. I think you have to then / World's Fair or something because it doesn't come up on his main page. It's like a religious page or something. But in it, he has a link to every single thing on the internet on every single World's Fair. It's the most incredible resource I've ever seen. And for these big fairs, take Chicago, for example, there were 6 books by historians written immediately after the fair. So 1894, 6 books, some of them 7,000 or 8,000 pages long, of information on supposedly the history of the world, history of the United States, history of Chicago, and then everything at the fair. All of these fairs had guidebooks, the equivalent of Lonely Planets, that were, again, 1,000, 2,000 pages long that list every restaurant, every exhibit, what's in every building, it's mind-blowing the amount of information that's available if somebody wants to look into it. And it was just weird that no one had really decided to actually just how far can we dig into it until I decided to write the book. And because it was, like you say, Chris, it's so strange. To me, it required a second level of digging.
And it seems interesting too, because as you allude to in the book also, it's not like they're reflecting a history or a picture of the reality that's happening right then and there. It's almost like they're trying to construct something from scratch, right? They're building a narrative.
Exactly. And that's why I felt that also the study of these things, this is long before our current situation was happening. This was in 2019 when I did the research, and it was already starting to indicate that, like, wait a minute, this almost seems to be like the word reset was already being thrown around in alternative historical communities at that time. And it almost seemed like that these world fairs were like the marker point of the previous world before and the world we know of as our current reality since then. And that these fairs may have been the propaganda tool of their time, especially for history, to present the historical narrative that they want going forward, because each of these fairs had a large part of them were beyond the massive technology exhibits, which were strange in themselves. Then you had the human zoos, which were basically designed to show the savages around the world, and show their inferiority compared to the fairgoers who were going to them, to show how evolved they were compared to because they shipped pygmies and aboriginals, and they brought native Indians from all over the world, and put them through in Buffalo. They made them slaughter 7,000 dogs in the Colosseum and then eat them, so that the people could watch the Indians, be savages live in person. And then you had on these things called the Midway, which is where the word came from. It's from the Chicago Fair, sort of the place of carnival rides and fun and beer and dancing girls. But they also had a lot of historical exhibits, things where you could go to ancient Rome, you could go to Constantinople, you could go to Siberia, you could go to Germany, you could go to see a Boer War battle, and I almost got the sense they're generating the historical narrative. I mean, this is, if you get enough people in high enough places, if all the teachers of a city all go and see the World's Fair, well, they're all going to go and teach, well, this is what they told me about ancient Rome, so it's got to be true. The World's Fair wouldn't be lying. This is run by the Smithsonian, so they must know what they're talking about. And it wouldn't take long to generate the historical narrative you want. And then, like you say, if people are going to hold on and disagree with it, well, we have these wonderful insane asylums for you. Off you go. And within a generation, you've got the historical narrative you want in everyone's mind.
Well, in situations like this too, as is what is happening right now, I always want to look behind the scenes as to who is pushing this, who's funding this. Mm-hmm. So who was funding these world fairs? Were they the same sorts of institutions all around the world, or how did that happen?
It's hard to say. I mean, in many cases, they would usually be almost what you would call, at least in the United States. We can talk a lot about the U.S. The more reason I focused on the U.S. expositions, not because I'm from North America originally, but because America is supposed to have Canada, etc. They're supposed to have such a short historical period. The arrival of the colonists was only supposed to happen in the 1700s. So by the 1800s, you're only talking a total of a 200-year time frame that there's been anybody from Europe in the new world, as opposed to Europe. You could say, well, they had all these buildings for 1,000 years. It's not that big of a surprise. So for me, it was much more interesting to try to examine where these buildings could have come from in that time frame. Generally, in North America, I found they would be financed by what we would call robber barons. The ones who were into steel making, into the railroads, into the elite of the day, right? The millionaires that would be the equivalent of billionaires now. These are all the ones that are pumping the money in, and the big bankers. They're pumping the money into the fairs, and they're losing tons of money. And one thing, anyone who knows of someone who gets super rich, one of the ways they get super rich is they don't lose money. They don't put their investments into anything that's not going to gain them profit, or at the very least be equal. But I'll read you what it said about Philadelphia after they had lost the $4 million. And what was said about it was, let me make sure I've got the quote correct here. It's not, this was written in one of the historical books on the Chicago Fair, talking about the loss in Philadelphia. It is not, however, on the basis of dollars or cents that the success of such an effort can be estimated. Therefore, it's obvious that making money had nothing to do with what the fairs were all about. There was already something else going on. And again, I think that something else is creating a particular worldview that before you had television, before you had newspapers, before you had movies, before you had the internet, before you had this kind of way of potentially brainwashing a population, something like a traveling circus would be the perfect way of doing it. And that's almost what I could classify these world fairs. It was like a traveling Disneyland that was going all over the world with the same message.
Yeah. And it was kind of ingenious to sort of mix entertainment in with the narrative that they were subtly, or maybe not so subtly, trying to push on people. Yeah. And all of this calls into question the subjectivity of how it is that we piece together our history, like the little clues that we take out of context and we put them together and call that a full picture, which it hardly can be.
It was all a bit shocking for me because, again, okay, I went through as a historian, and I was always a bit not on the page. I was always battling my professors over things, even back in university. But there was a limit I would go. I would never not say a World War I didn't happen or something. That would never cross in my mind. But I might question a reason as to why they're telling me the war started or whatever, right? I would have these kind of. But it wasn't until I did my Egyptian book and I started realizing that pretty much all of standard archaeology is a lie. Everything we're being told, I spent months on site at all of these places in Egypt and Mexico and whatnot. And once you actually see the building quality, and you see the stonework, and you see the way the statues have been carved, and then you see energetically what the energy of these sites can actually do, what you can do at them, you begin to recognize that some primitive people with some copper tools can't possibly do this. It's obvious. It just cannot be done. And yet that's the story that was coming. And I knew right away, wow, we've got a major thing going on that's really trying to take humans away from their power. But I never had thought that, modern history must be mostly true. I never really made the shift until I started going deep enough into the World's Fairs, deep enough into these cities, particularly San Francisco, as I'm sure when you read the book and you read the San Francisco chapter, that must have blown your mind. And it's kind of like when I said the book was done, I'm going to put it out, I was like, I don't believe anything about history anymore on any level. It's all a lie now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I find that exhilarating on one level, but on another level, how sinister potentially that could be. Like, what is being covered up? Why are we being told a particular narrative? Like, how are we being socially engineered, to what end?
Yeah. And once you start to see that you don't have, for example, any kind of validity in your history, and of course, I don't believe we have validity in any area. It doesn't matter whether it's science or religion or economics, or it doesn't matter. It's all a lie. But when you don't have a history, because history is your explanation as to why you are where you are. It's important for that reason, that when someone says, why do we do things like this? Oh, well, because of this in Rome and this in here, and then this happened in France and this. Oh, okay. People go, oh, well, that makes sense, kind of thing, And so if we don't have a history at all that we can honestly say we can trust, it leads into question, was there a history? It leads you into that ideas of, are we living in a simulation? Because if this is some type of simulation or some type of like a video game type reality, then if whatever day one, that the day the game was flipped on, you might say everything before that is just a concept. It never really happened. It's just an idea to start the game off on day one with the characters doing whatever they do. And this makes you start to wonder, well, we don't really know our history, and we can't know our history. How do we know we had one at all? Never mind that it's wrong. It takes you to the next step. How do we know how do we know how long this thing has really been going on, this thing we call life on planet Earth? It starts to move you into so many different questionings, which is, I think, one of the reasons people like to just accept whatever it is they're told about anything. Because once you have to start questioning one thing, you can question something else. You can question something else. And eventually you have to start questioning the foundation of, where am I? Who am I? What is this place? And that's scary for a lot of people. So it's better just to accept and move along.
Well, I think it's super easy to do in the culture that we live in that's so media saturated, because media has taken the place of direct experience so much. So we live in the realm of experts. So these are the people that map reality for us and tell us, what is legitimate to consider, to even consider, and what isn't. So we don't even get to push the envelope ourselves. I should say many people don't do that, because they just rely on the people who supposedly know what they're talking about to tell them what
Yeah.
is valid and what isn't.
Yeah, and that takes me back to a book that was written in the 1970s called something like The Four Reasons to Eliminate Television or something
Oh
like
yeah.
that by
Uh-huh.
Jerry Mander.
Mhm.
And one of the key things he was talking about was the way television is structured is it fools the viewer into thinking what you see you've actually experienced.
Yes.
You watch lions in the Serengeti, and you think because it's been images, because there's things going on, because there's an expert telling you what's happening, you think something in your mind thinks I've been there. I know what lions are like in the Serengeti, and like, well, no, you've seen a pieced together production of what the documentary maker wants you to think about lions in the Serengeti. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. The only way you would know is get on a plane and go there yourself and spend a month and find out. But like you say, it's replaced the idea of experience. I don't need to experience it. I know what it's like. I wonder how many people, for example, would say they know what it's like to be at what if they say, what's it like at Wrigley Field, or what's it like to be a Cubs fan at a game? I bet you hundreds of people would give you an answer, but have you been to Wrigley Field? No.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I've seen all the games on TV, so I know what it's like. It's wow, that's where we are.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because it's almost like these expositions are the beginning of that mediaization, like the media coming in between reality and the story that we believe, because as these quote unquote savages, the primitive peoples are being delegitimized and being shown to be, primitive and savage. Those are the ones that had the oral traditions. So
Right.
the story that they're getting, they're passed on from generation to generation. Whereas the story that we're getting is the one that we're seeing right in front of us, whatever spectacle we happen to be focusing on.
That's a really good way of presenting it. And I'll give you, here's an example for everyone, just to see the level of possible indoctrination might be going on. So this is what you could be seeing historically at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. You can go to ancient Rome, a colossal exhibit with over 400 actors employed to give the visitor the illusion of going back in time to the life of gladiators. A large arena called the Hippodrome showcased chariot races, jousting, boxing, and gladiatorial clashes with 200 persons, 40 animals, including tigers, lions, and leopards. The finale was a reproduction of Nero's Rome burning. How about the Tyrolean Alps? That's a 21 village cottages, cathedral, gigantic mountains, where the visitor could ride a simulated tram car through the Bavarian Alps where real cattle and goats would be in pasture. Dancers and musicians entertained the crowd. Then we've got Jerusalem. That was 11 acres and included 22 streets, 300 buildings. They were replicated the stable in which Jesus was supposed to be born, the Golden Gate, the Mosque of Omar, etc. Over 1,000 people from Jerusalem traveled to the United States to participate and work in the exhibit. You had the streets of Cairo. You could go to a replica of Luxor Temple. You had the streets of Seville. You had the Gypsy Lane of Barcelona. You had the Great Siberian Train Ride, where you had the illusion that you were taking the cross-continental Russian train ride, and they would take all the scenery away, replace it. The actors would all change costumes, and you'd be in a new town. You had the Irish Village with the replica of St. Lawrence's Gate. Paris was replicated during medieval times. Constantinople, the Chinese Village, the streets of Old St. Louis. That's just some of it.
Yeah.
Imagine the scale, first of all, of the size of it. How many tens of thousands of actors are required to build the illusion that you're real? It's not just like like you say, you're watching something. You're in it. You're immersed supposedly in ancient Rome or in Jerusalem, and you're fooled and tricked into thinking this is what it must be like. Like, what an indoctrination tool, if that's what you want to use it for.
Exactly, and so thorough too. Yeah. It's amazing. It's. I was just astounded to hear about.
11 acres of that fair just for Jerusalem.
Wow.
22 streets you could experience. Like, wow. Never mind the whole rest of the fair. Just that in itself.
Exactly.
Like, wow.
And then go get a corn dog after that.
And then go get your whatever. So you've got that aspect of it. And then you've got the other side of it is, where do the buildings come from? Like when we go back to the first step of it, you have to start asking, well, how did they get these buildings done? When a modern building contractor with unlimited money needs 15 years to do it, and they can do it in 2 years. And what's also so bizarre when you look at photos of the supposed construction of these fairs, or even if you look at the construction of of like any U.S. state capital, particularly these ones in the Midwest, like where you are. They're great ones to go see because they're beautiful buildings, like right like from downtown Rome with massive towers, beautiful statues. And if you look at the construction photos, there's no road that's been built to lead up to it. So you're hauling this massive stone, massive stuff, building these dome structures, but you can't take a couple of weeks to build a road to make your transportation easy. It's things like that that just you should just throw a switch in your mind that says something's wrong with this.
Yeah.
And when you look at sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, there's hardly anybody on the site, on the work site. Like, there's just a few people that don't look like they're working at all.
Yeah, you get these photos. I showed these building contractors the building photos, particularly from St. Louis. We have the most photos of the St. Louis Fair. And you'll always get something similar. You'll see a building in the distance completed with maybe like just a bit of the roof not done, scaffolding on the side of the building. Yeah, like you say, 2 or 3 guys standing next to a ladder, and then just nothing, just like mud and dirt and nothing. And he looked at this right away and said, well, where's your building supplies? I mean, if you're building this, even if you're building the scaffolding, you got to have a stack of lumber here. Where's your stack of lumber? Where's your bathrooms? If you got 40, 50,000 guys working, where are they going to the bathroom? Like, you have to have things close to the site. Where's the indication that anyone's eaten a sandwich or had a cup of coffee or anything on this site? He was very clear. I don't know what this is, but nobody's been at this site for like at least 2 years.
And the waste in and of itself, I've done construction before, and there's so much stuff that just gets tossed aside, for something that magnanimous. Like, the waste itself would take a whole, village worth. It's crazy.
And if you do have a workforce of 40 or 50,000, which they say they had, who's feeding them? Where's the food coming from? How much is required just for that? For the it's just the logistics of it. And the photos show none of it. The photos just show a bunch of magnificent completed buildings. And again, we're talking magnificent buildings. I mean, again, if you don't know what we're talking about, please just Google Columbian Exposition, 1893, St. Louis Fair or Buffalo Fair, 1901, whatever, and look at the buildings. And they try to tell you, the historical narrative tries to say, they're built so quickly because they're built cheap and efficiently using a thing called staff, which is basically a type of plaster that was invented in the luckily just in time for one of the Paris fairs, and then they put it up with wooden scaffolding, and this is how all the buildings were done. One building in Chicago, the manufacturer's building, could comfortably keep 300,000 people inside of it. You're going to build that out of plaster and wood. Now, granted, I have seen there is a metal interior in there. So, I mean, before anyone comments, I have seen the metal building struts inside of it, but that doesn't mean it wasn't an original building there and they just restructured it. Or how about the Buffalo Electrical Tower? Because for sure that's supposed to be built. That was 395 feet high. There was supposed to be an elevator that took people to the top level where you could see from the top of the electrical tower all the way to Niagara Falls. These are going to be rich, elite people doing this. Do you want the tower to collapse, making it out of wood and plaster, and having 500 people all of a sudden dead because you let them take an elevator? No, of course not. Many of these buildings, I'm not saying all those buildings, but for sure, so many of these buildings had to be likely there for a long, long time, maybe hundreds or thousands of years, and they just built the rest around it in this cheap manner to kind of, which is a project in itself, just to build like that Midway in St. Louis. What a project that is. So you're either talking about buildings from an old civilization that's been hidden away, or you're dealing with building technology that they're not supposed to have and somehow seemingly disappeared from our world for quite a long time. Like someone had suggested once that they maybe they could have done this in this speed if they had 3D printing. The equivalent, like you just had kits and you could literally just, the same way we could 3D print a building today, they just had even better, bigger stuff, and you just 3D print it and boom, 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 put it together. And if you put the right kind of interior blocking on it, yeah, that could work. Well, they're not supposed to have 3D printers in 1890, so how did that get done?
Well, you present in regards to this quandary 3 scenarios in the book, and I believe the other one is the mud flood one, right?
Well, that one is always a little touchy for me because it's a subject that there's 2 words that flow around Well, I guess there's people questioning me now about what you might call the alternative history community, because this is my main focus is still the stuff I wrote in Falling for Truth, and trying to have people work on their inner journey and go within and find truth on all levels, and the work that's required to see the honesty of themselves in reality. And I've sort of in the more recent time, because of I feel we don't have much time left in this realm, I've wanted to focus more on that and less on more historical stuff. So people are wondering, is there wondering about me? But anyway, the point of it all is that one of the words in the community, buzzwords in the community that sort of started, because this has only been going for about 5 years. The flat earth was kind of the big thing before this. That was kind of the big zeitgeist for a while. And then this became a zeitgeist about 2015 or so. And two words got thrown out, being Tartaria, this idea of an old civilization in Russia that's kind of been hidden from the world, but then branching it out, that this same thing was everywhere all over the world, which might be true. And in fact, I think that is true. I just don't like using that particular word to label it, because I don't. It would be like labeling Europe for everywhere. No, Europe is a place, and it has separate countries, and they have separate names. So I feel there's more something that might have been homogeneous, but I hate using that name for it. And then the idea of a mud flood is a word that's kind of being very specificated in being that some sort of catastrophic event occurred maybe in the 1700s, maybe in the 1800s worldwide, that covered most of the world in mud. And that and there are certainly evidences to say something like that is definitely, there's truth in it. I can't also say that's not true, that there aren't certainly places that I go and I see buildings that are built on slants, but the buildings windows just don't match the street, and or photographs of buildings actually being dug out of what's obviously mud. And so I don't dispute that, but I like to think that rather than having to label catastrophe only by mud, I think there may have been many different types of catastrophe, of which what might be specified by this mud problem as being just one of them. Like when I look at the city fires to me look like Dresden in 1944. So to me, I think all options should be open. And I think if people when they hear the word mud flood, that just means catastrophe. There was a civilization here, there was something great going on here, and then something came to destroy it. Then I think you're going to be okay with the term. If you try to force it into then forcing a particular viewpoint or a box to place it in, that's going to get harder for you.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, in regards to these expositions too, it seems like the locations were of importance too, because often they were on sacred lands, right?
Yeah, I found that put more after I wrote the book. It's one thing I never bizarrely thought of, and I don't know why I didn't think of it, is really look at all the sites now. I had done it for Jackson Park in Chicago, and nothing about it necessarily jumped out at me as being really odd or strange. But when I started looking at other sites, thanks to a woman named Camellia Crown, I think was her name, she started looking at some of the World's Fair sites and what's on them today, and the way they've been, because they're usually parks or golf courses, and how the parks have been made with very odd sacred geometry, and how they connect to other places where World's Fairs used to be. And so it seems like even though the fair ended, whatever was happening energetically on the sites has not gone away, that it's still continuing to the present moment. And some of the geometry on the sites that are there are weird. The places they were built on, like in St. Louis, they supposedly, again, we don't know, but there were supposedly 80 or 90 Native Indian mounds, very similar to Cahokia on the other bank of the river, that they apparently, according to them, just bulldozed and then built the fair over top of. Well, how do we know that they were Indian mounds and not the buildings that they just dug up and then painted and made them look nice? And these are the buildings that we built them, not, oh yeah, these are the buildings the Native Indians used to have. Yeah. And this was their real city, and this is the best way of hiding the evidence. I remember reading maybe 15 years ago of a story of a archaeological find in the 1950s in somewhere in southern Ontario, and somebody or in like what we call cottage country there, And he had found what seemed to be remnants of a very high-structured native Indian village. And when he brought the geologists in, they claimed it was 50,000 years old, which is far beyond any sort of civilization is supposed to be in North America. When he started presenting his findings at the University of Toronto, I think that's where he was from, 2 weeks later, bulldozers came in, bulldozed the whole site, and they built a resort over top of it. Just like that, gone. Research finished. And you wonder how many times has that happened again and again and again when something historical comes up that might cause a problem to the narrative, you just bulldoze it and it's gone. And these fairs might be a way of bulldozing the past.
Yeah, exactly. There's a couple of different scenarios that could be going on with the building of these things on sacred ground. They could be sort of usurping the power that is where the ley lines cross, where the reason they are sacred lands in the first place, or they could sort of be, sort of erasing that aspect of it and trying to, that's again, start a new narrative.
Yeah.
At a PowerPoint.
At a PowerPoint. I relate that a really good example when I was in England, right? That story I tell of Stonehenge. And I've been waiting to go to Stonehenge for a long time in my research. And when I finally got there in 2010 and I went to the site, the energy was dead. Like there was just nothing. It was like, my home has better energy than this place. And I thought, well, maybe because there's so many people that come here, even though they don't get to go inside anymore, they've roped the whole thing off. I was going the next day to the inner where you get the special tour and you go, and so I'll touch the stones. And then I went the next day, nothing, zero.
Wow.
And I thought, well, something must be wrong then, I could, but the next day I went to Avebury. Much larger stone circle, and it has the whole serpent, very similar to Serpent Mound in Ohio, just made out of stones. When I went to Avebury, my legs were so much on fire I couldn't stand still. I actually had to keep moving the entire time because I felt if I stopped, I was going to catch on fire. That's how much energy was at Avebury. It was unbelievable. And so I'm like, well, all these other people are writing about Stonehenge and this beautiful energy. Something must be wrong with me, right? I must be off somehow. But then a couple of years later, I bumped into a Russian website for some Russian researchers. They have done great work on historical stuff. And I found these about 300 photographs from the 1950s where the archaeological team came in, removed all the stones, put them on trucks, drove them off the site. They dug up the entire area of Stonehenge to do some kind of dig, I guess, looking for whatever. All you can see is they brought stones back. Of course, we can't tell for sure that they're the original stones they took away. They may have made copies of the stones, and then they cemented them in place. The stones are actually now cemented in place. So we don't know if we have the right stones. We don't know if they're in the original location, and now they've got cement in them rather than collect. And so it makes, obviously now I know why there's no energy here. The whole thing's been destroyed and dismantled.
Yeah. Or possibly even counterfeited.
Or counterfeited, and maybe there's in the basement of some underground facility, the real Stonehenge stones are there and doing whatever they're doing, So it's stuff like this that obviously this idea of energy and power at all of these sites is just as important as anything that is built on top of it. And that's why it's so important to me. I've told so many people that if you're especially researching the ancient world, you can't do that through the internet. You can't do that through a book. You have to go to Giza. You have to go to Dashur. You have to be at Saqqara, and you have to feel the difference because they all feel a little different. Dashur and Saqqara feel completely different sites. The pyramids are completely different when you're in them. And the more of these experiences you have, the more you can not only with your eyes see what's different, what's unique, and how they're constructed, and what the stone is doing, but you're feeling the difference and really also getting a sense of what is the site telling you by what it feels and what you're doing there. It's all a part of the package of understanding something that is actually so far beyond our normal, modern, simplistic daily living. Like they're literally on another level of everything. And you can't know that unless you've been there. And we're still only touching a tiny piece of what was there. So much of it is gone. We're just getting like the remnants of what's left, and it's still overpowering.
Yeah. Exactly. And you hear these, what we call myths or legends and all of these
Yeah.
crazy wild tales of, creatures that are,
Yeah.
out of somebody's imagination. And who knows that those things might be absolutely literal representations of things that happened in the past on our planet.
Yeah, for sure. One thing, because I've studied lots of that stuff too over the course of my life. I found all of those subjects interesting when I was younger, before I began this sort of research 25 years ago after some tragedies in my life. But one thing I always felt was the people who are talking about it and sharing their stories and whatever, I felt always they're very genuine. So their experience is a very honest experience. Um, what it actually was, that's the next step. But I wasn't doubting many. I didn't think any of them were lying. When you talk about they meet these creatures or these things in the forest or whatever, I'm saying I think that's a true experience. So is it an experience with a particular creature? Is it an experience of some sort of thought transference that's relating to something energetically? Are they seeing, like you say, something from the past that is sort of bled into the modern time frame? And who knows what it might be. But I never doubted the honesty of the people sharing these things, because if you're going to, especially 30, 40 years ago, you share something like that, you're going to be the laughing stock of your community. So it's not something you would think of it, I'm gonna pretend that I saw this in the forest so I can be laughed at for the rest of my life and never get a job again. No.
Exactly.
No, you're taking some courage to step forward and say, I know everyone's going to laugh at me, but I have to tell you this.
Mm-hmm. Well, to bring this into the present for at least a bit, you mentioned that you felt like we had a limited time in this realm, and then we hear talk of they're just blatantly saying it, the Great Reset. Like, what do you think's happening? What do you think another one of these resets is about to happen?
Or we're in the middle of it, yeah. And I think that's even why the time I spent writing this book is useful in some way right now, not to keep studying the past per se, but to try to figure out what can we take to it, to what's happening right now. I'm wondering what the equivalent of the World's Fairs will be in like 5 years. What will be the thing that will be the checkmark marker point of we've crossed the line between the old world and the new world? And I think that's really what these fairs were. That was sort of the presentation of like, the old is gone. This is the order that was, this is the reset from that one, and now we're in this next one. And I it's hard to say, because it's really dangerous, because of how easily the population has behaved in an almost hypnotized fashion. That the ability to critically think about anything seems to be gone. Like, you can never question someone who really does research, really digs into something, and has a viewpoint different than mine. We can discuss it and argue it, but I'm not going to ever personally attack that personally, because they put time in. They put a month of research in, and this is how they come across it. But if the difference is not doing any research at all, you read something in a paper, you look at something on somewhere, and you just, that's the way it is. Don't even and will staunchly defend that position even though you don't know anything about it. That's what's really terrifying. And I think we're going to see more and more of that as we go on, almost like you've seen a frequency drop. I talked about this with Matt from Quantum of Conscious, and we sort of this idea that we've dropped a frequency, and anybody who is tied to the realm kind of just dropped with it. So that we went from like 2 to 1.5, and that's whatever. But a few people didn't drop. For whatever reason, there was an awareness, or there was a blocking mechanism, and you didn't go down. And now all of a sudden the problem is, before maybe you were here and the other people were there, well, you could still communicate even though they kind of thought you're a little crazy, but now they've gone here. You haven't actually risen. You haven't actually, there's an awakening happening in the world. No, there's just a whole lot of people dropping further in their frequency, and now there's no way to communicate. There's no way to do anything with those with the people who are, you might say, fully in the reset. So you've got that problem. Communication is dead. And the second level is, now you see more clearly. Here you saw the world pretty good, but now you're seeing so much more. So a lot of people who might say didn't take this frequency drop now are seeing so much more so quickly, getting so many more insights about themselves and reality, and where they've been for a long time, what this place is. It's confusing for them because it's happening so quick. Usually this takes years, and it's taking weeks for some people. So it's another thing I've tried to say in some of the videos and things I've done, is to kind of be okay with that if that's happening for you. It's you're lucky in one sense that you're getting all this stuff. It's just unlucky that it's coming so fast and so hard that you have no processing time for it. But don't try to push it away. It's actually, you're seeing through a lot, and there's a great opportunity. This is the thing I see with right now, as destructive as this is, and as bad as this is going to be, because this is just warming up. This is going to be really bad. But there's always an opportunity. The more things get bad and tragic, there's always, you might say, that doorway out of Plato's cave gets a little bit easier to spot. And so if people really want answers, really want something truthful, really want to know something, I think the greatest chance to do it that you've ever had is right now.
Yeah. I think the extremity of the pendulum swinging from one extreme to another, I think it has to get bad, as you say, because that has to match the level of hypnosis that everybody needs to be woken up from, So the alarm needs to sound really loudly in order for some people to be forced to, sort of see things as they are.
Yeah. As long as you're having a happy dream, you don't want to wake up. You only want to wake up when it becomes a nightmare. Mm-hmm. And so that's why tragedy is usually the doorway for 99% of people. Somehow something difficult in their life has pushed them to have to see the world in a different way, and that's where we are.
Well, and it's kind of a strange dichotomy that the people that are in the trance, they seem to be the ones that are most deeply in this hell realm. Like, they're the angry ones. They're the ones that are shaming people. They're the ones that are, the most self-righteous and speaking without reflection or without questioning themselves. So it's an interesting topsy-turvy. It's like things have flipped.
Things have flipped, and as long as there's still people out there trying to change it, trying to fix them, trying to get them to, but if you start to recognize the gap is so big now, that the communication cannot even have, even if you want to, even if it's your best friend, even if it's your spouse, even if it's your mom and dad, you're not here. You can't have that communication with them anymore. There's no common ground. The common ground frequency is gone now. And so you have to focus on yourself now. And if someone else eventually changes and wants to come with you and wants to talk with you about things, great. But if you can't force it, if you're going to try to force these kind of conversations with people, I think you're going to be really disappointed.
Absolutely. And you risk solidifying and making the gulf between those two extremes even wider.
Yeah. So I know a lot of people are having those issues right now. And again, it makes you wonder, what kind of issues were people having in the 1800s? Well, we know the native Indians. We know what kind of life they must have had in the 1800s. Who knows? At first they had all their cities stolen, maybe, but at the very least they had whatever communities they built after that, completely destroyed, and their culture attempted to be destroyed. It's amazing that if it weren't for a certain number of very courageous people in the 1880s and the 1890s of these Indian tribes, of finding ways to not lose their whole oral history, and not ways to lose their language, and not ways to lose their wisdom knowledge, it would all be gone. Yeah, it would be eradicated. And so we're actually almost lucky that any of it is still with us. I know one of the medicine men I spent a long time with, I've been very lucky to have been with a Zen monk for a long time, and several native Indian medicine men and on their reserve. And they told me one time in a sweat that, because I was talking about some of the things that they could do. I mean, I've seen them do some pretty miraculous healings on people, and in the sweats. And they were very, very, of course, humble, and just said, whatever we can do, it's nothing compared to the old ones. What they mean is the medicine people 300, 400, 500 years ago, and they said, and a lot of what they knew is just lost. We don't have it anymore. We don't even know what they knew anymore. It's all we have is what we have left. It's quite sad to see it, and it's also makes you wonder, what did they know?
Yeah, for sure. And it also lends another level to the genocidal nature of sort of the ethnic cleansing that went on in the past. Like when you have an oral culture, you can't just go and destroy their library. That's not their information point. They're each
Right.
parts of that information point. So you need to eradicate the whole thing in order to bring in a new narrative.
Yep.
Yeah. Interesting. What is the temperature like in Norway? Not physically, of course, but with this incredible polarity that's going on right now.
Norway is one of the countries in the world that you might say has the most trusting population of its government, and might be almost classified as robotic. Very individualism is not well liked here. So you need to be like everyone else. Like every kid in school has to wear a t-shirt, for example. Maybe they can have a different color on their t-shirt, but you wouldn't want to wear a sweater because that's totally different from everybody else. So it's got this very homogeneous. So people are, and it's been this has been a very wealthy country now for 40 or 50 years because of the oil. So there's been no problems. It's been very comfortable. So here, you might say, though, the good part of it is there hasn't had to be these really hard measures against the population like you would get in a place where there could be pushback, easy pushback, whether it be France or England. So while there's been some issues here, and of course it doesn't matter. It's strange, right? The whole thing. It hasn't taken the next level because I think the government knows that no matter what they tell people to do, 85% of them will do it no matter what it is. If it's you got to paint your face blue and jump on a trampoline at 2:00, a huge number of population here will just do it because it's on TV. They told me to do it. It can't be wrong. As opposed to places, whether it be the U.S. or England, where a lot of people just say, I don't care what they're telling me to do. I ain't doing it. That's a totally different structure that has to be dealt with. So in one sense, that's nice. But yeah, of course, it's always weird to see how compliant people have been to this whole thing and how quickly compliant they've been.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, here it's the same. It can be the same way too, but it kind of depends on where you're at. Unfortunately, this whole situation has been very politicized here. So if you question the narrative, of course, obviously you're a Trump supporter and a racist and, the litany of other things that nobody should ever be.
Right.
And if you follow the program, then you're obviously the good guys, which of course are the Democrats. So it's sad that it's just that simplistic, that there's no nuance to it whatsoever.
Yeah, but that's the easiest way to do things, right? Make things
Absolutely.
Black and white. So there's no middle area, there's no gray ground, and then it's easy to separate them from us. And that's like anything, that's how it's always been done. Them and us, and make it as simplistic as possible to determine who's on which side. And again, it just makes me wonder what we went through, how many times we've gone through this in some level as a species, and how little of it survived to where we are now as part of even our oral history. I've wanted to take time and look back into more mythology and more folklore of cultures that maybe don't get a lot of attention, and see, is there something like this in their folklore, in the culture that's talking about this, so that this kind of stuff is there. We just didn't recognize that's what they're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. That's fascinating. Back to the world expositions for a little bit, because I think it's kind of all tied in, really. There were certain ones of these expositions that were world sanctioned. What was the difference? What did that mean?
That's a good question. I actually don't know what that means for sure. Mm-hmm. But there was something created in Paris. And they were the ones who decided what could be called a world exposition or world fair, and what instead would be like a second tier exposition that could be called like an exposition, but not a world exposition. Like, for example, the one in Omaha, or the one in Nashville, or the ones in like Louisville or whatnot. Those would be giant expositions, but they didn't get this special title. Why would they get the special title? Obviously, it has to do with, I guess, the amount of money that's going to go in, and obviously some sort of ritualistic date, I would guess. Like, how does Buffalo get a World Exposition? That's also one of the ones that just blows your mind. Like, Buffalo, New York, World Exposition in 1901. But of course, that one was probably the weirdest of them all, because that's where President McKinley was murdered, was assassinated. So it becomes one of the most remembered expositions because of the assassination. So to be quite honest, I have no idea what the reasoning was behind it. But if you actually, like, because if you go to Wikipedia, they'll have the listing of all the world expositions, the big ones. But then if you have to, and it's not easy to find, but you can go to the other ones. It'll give you a listing of all of them worldwide. The page is like, 5,000 through 2,000 or 3,000 of them all over the world that were happening. And again, so similar story, like one in Copenhagen. Yeah. So they built next to the Tivoli amusement park. They built the building for the fair, a giant exposition building, which they immediately tore down as soon as it was over, and then rebuilt the new Rathaus, which is the building that sits there now, which is the city hall. That they just built. So again, logically, wait a minute, why not just build one multi-purpose building? First, use it for the fair; it's already there, and then you use it for your city hall afterwards. But no, we're going to build one thing and then have this and then just tear it down and build something else. So everywhere, this kind of logic just goes nowhere when you wonder. That's just not the way you would do any of these things. It's just so.
You mentioned that some of these expos happened in cities where they had recently had really catastrophic fires too, but a lot of fires started during these expos, right?
Well, that was be Chicago only. Chicago had fires at the fair. Mm-hmm. But for example, all the first fair buildings were in things called Crystal Palaces, but all of them burned down. There are none of them left. Every single one was burned down within. I think the one in England might have survived the longest into the 1920s or 1930s or something. But it's interesting. They all burned down. But the fairs themselves, yes, were all. I mean, every North American city has a fire in it in the 1870s, 1850s, 1860s, whatever, that literally burns the city to a crisp. But when you look, supposedly, again, because they're all wooden buildings, so once a fire starts, it's so easy for the fire to spread. But when you look at the photos, all you see is brick and stone. And you see melted stone, like you see melted, granite and marble. What kind of temperature do you need, first of all, to melt that? And then you see things like the buildings have been like sheared, and like the rock, the stone has like been cut in like almost laser cuts. And again, it looks more like warfare. It looks more like a bombing raid, or even when you look at the Civil War photographs of like cities in the South that were supposedly destroyed purposely by the Union Army, you have to wonder, okay, let's look at the cannons they're supposed to have. Let's look at the cannonballs they're supposed to have. How many times would you have to fire those cannons at the city and those buildings to create the level of destruction you're looking at? It would actually be beyond the thought process of the waste of material needed to get that result. There has to, again, something else is going on with all of this historical time frame that we had been lied to for such a long time. And again, it's been so great that so many researchers in the last 5 years, for various reasons, have come to this topic and have done, because no one person could possibly study all this themselves. It's so great a task, and it really needs like 50, 100, 200 people all doing their own research, all digging into stuff. And the only way we'll get somewhere, even now, even though I'm not going to do much of this anymore, like I say, I'm going to move into focus on other topics. Plus, being on a farm, I have so much work to do here. But it's like what people find, they have to treat it like a jigsaw puzzle. You're finding a piece of the jigsaw, someone else is finding a piece of the jigsaw. You have to work together and put the jigsaw pieces together and maybe start getting bigger and bigger parts of it. It's as long as people sort of try to hold on to what they find information-wise, try to sort of own it in some way, we're still not moving forward with getting closer to. Well, I don't think we'll ever get an answer, but at least getting closer to what might be a really logical theory. So it's really important that even though there's a tremendous amount of research being done by really good people, it's really important to share what we find, so that it's for continued research and continued understanding.
Absolutely. I think this would all make a great documentary too, because this is so visual. Like, you really don't see the weight of like what we're talking about here unless you see pictures, and there's even some film footage of this stuff too. It's just a sight to behold. It's so incredible.
I thought the same thing, Chris. I thought there was almost no better topic than the World Exposition / the history of some of these cities. Like, actually taking my book, like, I mean, we don't put the picture, but you can see the image if you're having to see this. I mean, that is the Chicago Exposition. That is, how is that not downtown Rome in the ancient times, or, you know?
Exactly.
And as a documentary, like you say, then you're producing the images directly to the person, along with the text, along with the commentary. To me, it was like, it's a perfect documentary subject.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
I hope someone decides to do it at some point, because it just is such the strangest topic I've ever come across. Again, because of what was at the fairs themselves. I'll give you an example. I told you about the books that list everything that are at the fair. So in one of the Chicago Exposition books, they go through it building by building. And I went through the Illinois. I thought I'll go through the Illinois building. So it's just a state building at the exposition. It took 80 pages of this book to describe all of the objects and artifacts in the building, whether it be paintings and tables and exhibits and whatever. 80 pages just for what you could see in one building at the Chicago Exposition. In some of the travel guides, there were doctors' statements that warned people that they called elderly or a bit ill, that you should not attempt to see large pieces of the fair in one day, because it's highly likely you will get sick and go to a hospital. You have to choose how you go and see the fair, and see it carefully and healthily.
Wow.
Yeah. Disclaimer at the start of the book, like, hey, you better take your time at the fair, because if you try to see it all, you might die.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and all built in 2 years on horse and wagon, with no roads, with no explanation of how all the equipment gets there, doesn't get there, where the workforce is, where it goes, and then just magically just disappears.
Beyond strange. It's way beyond strange.
It's way beyond strange, and it's way beyond. And like I say, everything that is. And there's always one building that survives. This is the part that's always also, there's always one particular building that they say, oh, this was the one we're going to place all the expensive art in. And so we have to have this one built specially so it's fire safe. And this is the building that'll become a library or a museum or something afterwards. So there's always one building that's left. They say we built one properly, but we didn't build the rest. But I'll give you a good example. That was at the Nashville Fair. You may remember from the book. So in the Nashville Fair, they built a replica of the Parthenon. But it wasn't the largest building at the Nashville Fair by any stretch of the imagination. But that's the one people remember, is this building of the Parthenon. But that building is still there. It's still in Nashville, Tennessee, because in the night just after the fair was over, it was, according to the history, it was claimed it was going to be too expensive to tear down this temporary structure. So they felt it was better to redo it again in stonework and make it a permanent structure. Okay, there's 3 other buildings that are twice the size, 3 times the size of this at the Nashville Exposition, but those buildings aren't too expensive to tear down and not keep as well. Yeah, so every time an explanation for anything is presented it's always just, once you look at it, but that's crazy. Yeah, that's obviously wrong. So that's also the part of it that gets so difficult is the more you examine every little piece of the story, the more every single thing is just not true. Why would the San Francisco Exposition be built and all torn down, except again for one building, the Palace of Fine Arts, I think, or whatever, in San Francisco. But at the same time, they were holding a joint one in San Diego, and they kept most of the buildings supposedly from the San Diego one. So why do you keep all the buildings there and keep none of the ones in San Francisco, particularly when you just had supposedly an earthquake 10 years previously? And again, you're supposed to have people actually at that time that the fair was actually